Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams D Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us recommends a record for everyone else to listen to and we review it. And now we are in the final episode of this unofficial Porcupine Tree 2000s retrospective. Just in case you all didn't know, up until this point, we have been preparing for the release of the reunion first album since this last one that we're talking about here, since the Incident Closure Continuations release. We are celebrating and building up to that release by talking about every single 2000s Porcupine Tree album up until this point. And this is the final episode where we talk about the Incident, the final record before the band unofficially disbanded. We started with 2000's Light Bulb Sun. Go watch all those videos if you haven't.
Link will be in the description for those. Yeah. So this has not really been like an official series because we've been doing these as part of our Record Club series off and on. But each of us have kind of taken it in turn to basically kind of pick an album and put it forward as our recommendation for the Record Club, since we take turns doing that from week to week. And the Incident is my selection, which worked out really, really nicely because while not going to have a huge hot take and say this is like on the level of the three records immediately preceding it, but I do think this is an underrated album, an under-discussed album for sure, and a record that I think has a particular kind of appeal that resonates with me for particular things that I enjoy about classic prog albums. So a lot of what Porcupine Tree is essentially is like a tribute to the classic era of 70s prog, but channeling that through heavier aesthetics, much cleaner and more modern production styles, and courtesy of Steven Wilson, concerns with more, I guess, 2000s era themes as well. And one of the things that's super, super cool about, at least to me, what Porcupine Tree did throughout the 2000s is that they modernized prog in really, really exciting ways, but they also didn't really try in any way to pretend that the inherent kind of excess and cheesiness and silliness of the genre is something to be, ashamed of or something to play down. Like Porcupine Tree records are very dark and they're very moody and they deal with kind of like societally dark themes and all that sort of thing, but they don't have the level of portent that, or at least they have a level of portent that comes with a level of self-awareness, I think. And I tend to enjoy Porcupine Tree the most when they're really leaning into that true nerdy prog aspect of what they do essentially, and nowhere do they really do that harder than on the Incident, which follows up a record like Fear of a Blank Planet by essentially doing a similar thing, but also doing a very, very different thing in a certain sense. Because Fear of a Blank Planet, which is the last record we talked about from Porcupine Tree, is this kind of like very concise, tightly wound set of songs based around a singular theme, a kind of non-linear narrative of sorts as well. But it was this kind of like cohesive, singular flowing statement, essentially. Not really a suite per se, but it kind of has the flow of a singular cohesive piece of music. And with the Incident, they kind of take that idea for structuring a record and go further with it. Essentially, the majority of this record being a singular 55-minute suite of songs that all kind of run into each other, that exhibit kind of various styles that kind of go a little bit all over the place sonically, and have kind of these regular moments of lengthier, more classic sounding prog that kind of staple the different sections of the suite, so to speak. So yeah, essentially it is a kind of doubling down on what was happening structurally on Fear of a Blank Planet, but it's also taking it much more in a Genesis Lamb Lies Down on Broadway direction of it being this, of the songs kind of bleeding into one another, and where one song ends another song begins, not really being super clear unless you're staring at the track list as the album's playing. And that, I think, is something that I really respond to in prog when it's done well. And I think there is definitely critiques to be made of the incident, and I'm sure we will make them. There's definitely reasons to feel more or less fond of the way that Porcupine Tree do this, or even the decision to do it in the first place. So I'm sure, and I know for a fact that you all have opinions on this. But yeah, that's, I think, the kind of core structural conceit that needs to be laid down to understand how to approach this thematically, and in terms of other things that are the band are doing with this record. I'll leave that to better, more equipped Porcupine scholars than myself to talk about. But yeah, it's a record that very much feels like a natural next step for Porcupine Tree in a certain sense, but also one that comes with a significant risk of alienating fans.
It's true that they sort of hit a real stride once Gavin Harrison joined the band on 2002's In Absentia. And I think that it's sort of commonly accepted that they were in such a consistent mode of output that by the end of the decade, near when they were trying to put this out, the band was suffering a bit of burnout. Stephen, in his book that I would recommend reading just because it's interesting, actually does sort of go into what he thinks is the problem with this record, because he himself views it as not quite a full realization of itself, and that while he and the label, when they sort of put the album out, were really going hard on the whole like song cycle concept, said that it was really more of just a lot of music that they tried to cobble together as best they could. And I think that that's partially sort of why this album is seen as, generally speaking, a bit of a downgrade of what came before it. I do agree with Riley and say that it is supremely under-discussed and to some extent underrated. The concept of the incident is a little bit weird, because you would expect it to be revolving around a narrative, maybe like some of their previous albums in this particular run have been. But the incident is really more a series of vignettes that are based around a central concept. And that sort of being the incident is a purposefully vague title that Stephen became fascinated with after he witnessed a car crash happen, where he saw it referred to on the news as an incident, and became kind of obsessed with the idea of extremely traumatic and impactful events happening to people and them being referred to as something as impersonal as an incident. So each song here is more or less a story or a description of an incident happening to a person, a group of people, but how this concept basically applies in different facets. And honestly, I think in terms of theme, the album, to me anyway, is one of Porcupine Tree's most unique releases. I think that this aspect of the record is maybe the point at which I am the most on board with what it's doing, in that even in its less substantial musical moments, lyrically, I think the sort of variety and theme here is really well realized and interesting, and sort of leads to the disparity between that and the musical content kind of being bizarrely amplified, to the point where a lot of the really shorter tracks on here are things that I really wish that the band developed more and elaborated on, just because the thematic content is so interesting. An example basically of what I'm talking about here can be found on songs like Great Expectations, which is supposedly about a man that Stephen knew or like lived in the same apartment complex as, who had schizophrenia. And these are really compelling moments of the band's writing at its best, I think, and even instrumentally at its most interesting. And then some of these songs just end really quickly, and it's cool to see how it fits into the flow of the album, but I also think that that's sort of bizarrely the weakest point of the record for me, is that while it does fit into the flow of a suite in the sort of progressive sense, it's also a suite that I feel should be developed more. All of the core tracks here are fascinating and interesting, and a lot of them just end before they can be properly musically developed. And this is all accentuated by the fact that this song cycle has like, it's 14 tracks long, and then there's just an EP stuck on the end of this album for some fucking reason. I've researched all over the fucking internet. There is no consistent reason as to why Flicker, Bonnie the Cat, Black Dahlia, and Remember Me Lover. I've seen explanations, but I've seen too many different ones to make a consistent call as to why that's the case. But if you look at the album, songs 1 through 14, this is a like second disc, technically speaking, where we have more songs here, and I'm not totally sure.
The way I interpret it is it's like an appended EP to the album. I think that my interpretation, again, it's strictly interpretation, not canon, because I can't verify this, but it seems
that commenters.
It seems to be that, yeah, the many commenters we get on our ass about this sort of thing. It seems to be that those are essentially more to be treated as bonus tracks, I suppose, like an appended EP, like Nil Recurring, for instance, in relation to the album that was released alongside, like as additional songs that were sort of considered, or songs that were related but kind of didn't fit into the flow of what they were trying to do. And it's definitely a curious decision to include them along with the album. I'll say, for one, that while it does sort of upset somewhat the structural kind of cohesiveness of the idea of making a sweet album, just having these extra songs at the end, they do get somewhat of a pass for me because I do really, really enjoy them.
They're all great songs.
I think for me, a big thing with this record is I almost feel that I think the concept is the biggest problem here, quite honestly, because if that whole song cycle idea was just not in place, and look, I get that's the design of the record, but I also think it's the record's biggest flaw, having to kind of adhere to this structure that I don't think feels particularly well defined within the concept of this kind of song cycle, because I find a lot of the ways these songs lead into and transition into each other to be a little unsatisfying. I think the best example comes quite near towards the end, where you've got Circle of Manas or whatever.
Manias, Circle of
Manias.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I'm just
Mania, but plural.
Yeah.
Manoff, the Hands of Fate.
It's one of the circles of hell, I think, in the classical literature.
Anyway, my stupidity aside, that song is like, I feel that song just kind of ends, like it feels like a hard cut, and then we go into I Drive the Hearse, and that's a moment where I think this whole song cycle concept really breaks in half, and that's just one example of moments where I think the whole concept doesn't work. Now, that all being said, I think a lot of the individual songs on here are quite enjoyable. The whole EP of extra songs, Flicker, Bonnie the Cat, Black Dahlia, and Remember Me Lover, I think are all mostly great songs. Like, in some cases, better than most of the material that's in the song cycle. The out I see to make this record better is to just forego the concept and smush it all together. But the downside is that kind of strips the record of what makes it fascinating to talk about. Would be the issue inherent in making it better. So I think, to me, that's kind of the intrigue of the incident. That is the incident, that making it better makes it worse and less interesting in a weird paradoxical way. But I guess those are my broad strokes thoughts.
And that's kind of one of the reasons why, one of the lines of thinking of it as to why I've kind of come around to being pretty positive on this record. In fact, kind of dampening a lot of the criticisms I had more generally, is because, this is the kind of thing that you can't get away with doing this too often, or even more than once, really. But it's such a refreshing kind of change of pace for a band like Porcupine Tree. It's kind of like you have this string of like meticulously crafted and fulsome and just expansive records, and then almost as like a kind of, you know, victory lap, which is what this album kind of feels like to me, considering that they would kind of hunker down and go and do other things after this, as it's kind of like flexing how many different sort of ideas and musical fragments they have and finding a way to kind of weave them into a tapestry. And I get that that's definitely going to lead to a less satisfying experience for people who are more keen on the, you know, consistent one single fully fledged 5 or 6 minute song after another. But I think because Porcupine Tree gave us so many of those records, they kind of earned the right to do this. And not only do they earn the right to do it, it kind of becomes more enjoyable and more exciting as a rare instance of a band truly letting their hair down. And this is where I think like the context of this discography matters for me, with how much I appreciate a record like this. It's a rare indulgence from a band that, despite the trappings of prog, don't typically tend to get all that indulgent in terms of like letting their hair down, so to speak. And so that, in that sense, I think the incident becomes a kind of a little pleasure in this discography, a little example of something a little more free form and truly allowing the band to kind of showcase their chops without having to worry about adhering to the rigidity of what their previous records have done. And yeah, that's not to discount any criticisms, obviously, but it is a way that I view the record that I think changes things I would typically be really harsh on and makes them sort of matter less to me, I suppose.
I see what you mean. But it's also just like, I'm firmly in August's camp, and perhaps even more so, because I think if you do take away like the structure and just focus in on the really great songs and cut a lot of what's surrounding them, I think the concept works better because it's more concise. It's more focused, it's leaner and meaner. And even as it is, with the sort of giant suite that comprises the album proper, it still feels vignette-ish and scattershot. And that wouldn't change if it was just a handful of these really great cuts on the album, because all of them deal with the concept, obviously, in very explicit ways. So I think making this leaner and absolutely incorporating the EP songs as well, whether that be just lumping them in at the end like it is now, or sprinkling them in throughout the track list, would make for a better experience overall. Take August's example of Circle of Manias into I Drive the Hearse. I think an even more egregious example for me is the incident into Your Unpleasant Family, which is like the title track here, I think, is like top 10, maybe top 5 Porcupine Tree songs. It's just terrific. One of their greatest achievements. And then it goes into Your Unpleasant Family, which is fine. It's all right. But that's not the problem with it. The problem with it is that it sounds like a complete non sequitur to the incident, which is strange because this is supposed to be one giant song. And, you know, if they're going to do that, you know, Cassandra Gemini, this is not.
I do have one particular issue with occasional moments on here. That being that I feel like the burnout from the end of the decade does kind of infect a couple songs on here as being kind of repetitive, and like the more substantial moments, like songs proper, that feel like they maybe shouldn't be here, or that I just don't really enjoy that much. I think the most prominent example of which is Drawing the Line, which is not a bad song, but I also don't really
also not a good
like
it.
Yeah,
counterpoint.
exactly.
I would say that is a bad song.
I
fair
completely
enough.
understand.
Yeah.
It's mainly because of the hook, and the hook is
I'm
bad to
drawing the line.
say.
I'm drawing the line. 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 I'm
Make it stop.
Drawing the line.
Steven's voice is also at its most nasally and annoying here. So basically, like everything about this song is just like, okay, like I get it, but also maybe this shouldn't be here. Would just be nice if it wasn't. And there are moments like Degree of Zero Liberty where I just feel like even if you're going for a 1 to 2 minute long thing, you know, you can make those moments feel interesting and textural and just sort of fascinating. Like one example of an album that does this really, really well that I love, that I know Riley also loves, that does this exact same thing, is Boards of Canada's GeoGaddy.
Oh, okay.
It's an album that takes a couple of like really brief moments to segue them into more substantial moments, and that works for the album's flow super duper well. It's really just that this album has these 1 or 2 minute long songs that are periodically interesting, but they don't segue or flow as strongly, and some of them are just a lot better than others. And then bizarrely at some points on the album there's like 3 of them in a row for like no reason, and you're just kind of like
right
like,
before
why,
time
like,
flies, there's just this like Your Unpleasant Family, the yellow windows of the evening train, and then immediately after,
Another train.
You've got
Train.
Degree Zero of Liberty, and it's like this just bam, bam, bam of short bullshit songs.
Fuck off! I love those songs.
They're all
Well,
bullshit, and you're wrong.
I like Yellow Windows in the Evening Train well enough. I think that one's cool, but like we can't deny here that like you have Time Flies at the center of that. My favorite song on here, which is enormous. This song is fucking huge, and this is everything I love about late period Porcupine Tree in one epic track. Same thing with stuff like Octane Twisted, which I just think are classic Porcupine Tree moments that just really hit with these like traditionally sort of like, this is probably the heaviest, nastiest sounding Porcupine Tree album, along with Fear of a Blank Planet. And I think these moments capitalize on this brilliantly, especially with Time Flies, which I think has a wonderful hook, great progressions in the middle there. Like this feels sort of like what if this album hasn't anesthetized, this is it. It's not quite that good, but I mean, goddamn, it's still fucking excellent.
So I'll just say off the bat, I definitely disagree with a lot of the critiques that have been lobbied in the last like 5 minutes or so, but I do think it's a flawed album still. But I'll try to articulate that in a way that's not self-contradictory. I like a lot of the shorter moments. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of them I really, really enjoy. I think that I'd probably agree with the consensus about Drawing the Line being the weakest thing here, if that is indeed a consensus. But I really like the shorter moments, and I like the way that they're strung together. I don't really have any issues with flow between them, more or less. I think, for instance, that a lot of them, if they were taken out, like to me, taking out a lot of the shorter moments here and kind of squishing the album together and integrating the bonus tracks would kind of rob this record of a lot of what makes it so special to me. And I think I would weirdly enjoy it less if it were more condensed. And I think in a certain sense, like what Porcupine Tree are doing here, and I hope this makes any sense, forgive me if it doesn't, but it's kind of like realizing the limitations of the wider swath of material that you have, that maybe it's not quite as a whole, like you don't have as many like holistic, perfect, 7-8 minute songs as you've had in the past. You just kind of have more ideas than fully formed songs. I think it makes a really strong use of that limitation in terms of whatever aspect of the writing process they're in, whether it's just a struggle to get songs put together. I think it takes advantage, or at least it twists that and exercises these ideas in the best way, in the most unique and interesting way that it could. Whereas if you just made it the 10 best songs, I still feel as though, I definitely feel as though its identity would be more lost in terms of like thematic structure and all that. And another reason why I enjoy this is the flow of the suite in particular has this kind of like feel of like an anthology movie, right? So you have these different stories, and it's kind of like, I know there's a specific movie that does this, but I just can't think of what it is, where you're kind of like the camera is just kind of like floating through this gigantic apartment complex or something, and just kind of like
the void.
Yeah, kind of like Into the Void, but also I'm pretty sure there's a film that also does this in a more fitting way. But Into the Void, let's go with Into the Void. It's kind of like Into the Void. Yeah, it's kind of like Into the Void, where the camera just kind of like floats through all these different, like past all these different apartment windows, and inside each different apartment is a story or some kind of thing that's happening. And sometimes you only get to see fragments of it. Sometimes the story doesn't end clearly. I think Robert Altman's Shortcuts actually kind of exemplifies this really well too. Sometimes you don't get a clear finish to the story. Sometimes you just enter halfway through and see a little bit of it. Then other times you are able to kind of settle in and see a more complex thing sort of play out. And that whirlwind sort of journey the album takes you on, where you get fragments of stories in tracks like Great Expectations, which I love, and Your Unpleasant Family, which I guess I'm more positive on than everyone else, and The Seance. And you get these little moments where you are
Cool.
Spending less time lingering, and you're getting these kind of fragments of stories that I think add up to just have a greater effect on me in terms of the holistic feel of the record than, you know, if they were in isolation or on their own sort of thing, like being interwoven with these longer pieces. And also there are some of these shorter tracks that are just there purely for assisting in the flow of the record, right? At least to tell their own stories. These are songs like The Yellow Windows of the Evening Train, for instance, which I think is a beautiful little interlude, and honestly sets up Time Flies beautifully, I think. Like it kind of clears the air before the big epic kind of unfurls in front of you. And I think that is something that I would miss if it were gone. Especially if you cut Your Unpleasant Family and Yellow Windows and just had the incident going into Time Flies. I think that wouldn't really work. That would be too jarring, at least to me anyway. I like the way that the interstitial pieces here are used and sequenced to kind of create this feel of like almost a journey or a dream that's kind of unfurling. Waking Life actually is maybe a good example too. It kind of has a feel of like that, where you're kind of just, you don't necessarily have a lot of control over the logic or what's happening and where you're going next. You're just kind of at the whim of something that's, you know, greater than you. And it's a weird sort of experience. Again, it's the kind of thing that you have to be in a particular mood for, and that most bands definitely wouldn't be able to get away with doing more than once. But it is a nice indulgence, and I enjoy it a lot. What I will say in terms of weaknesses, again, there are some moments here that I think definitely hold the record back. Drawing the Line, for one. Another instance of like a shorter track setting up a longer track after it really well is actually the way that the opener, Occam's Razor, sets up the Blind House for me.
Yeah.
Like if you just went, the album just started with a Blind House, that would be like, you know, kick the door down, awesome, cool. But I like the way you have a kind of tone setter, and then that just barrels you after that. So little things like that I love. But yeah, there are weaker moments for sure. Although honestly, looking at the track list, there's not that many of them. And I do think with regard to the bonus tracks or the extra 4 that are appended on the end, they're generally pretty great. I particularly love Bonnie the Cat, really gnarly, really intense, really vicious. I think Remember Me Lover has some beautiful progressions in it as well and unfurls really, really nicely. But weirdly, I had this thought listening to it this morning. I feel like I might even like this even more, or love this even more as a whole, if the second side, I suppose, were like as long as the first side. If you had this 55-minute suite, disc 1, and then this like disc 2 of like songs for like 50 minutes or so, I know that would be ridiculous and it would be absolutely bonkers.
That's still like a structure, like, because again, as it is, it's like you have that lopsided structure and the thing. It's just that like all these tiny little things accompanied with the fact that you really like, you know, when the one track leads into the bigger track, but the album only occasionally does that, and sometimes it'll do 3 smaller tracks and then the big track and then 2 tracks, and it's just like the album's just doing way too much.
Yeah, you know what, and I probably would agree with that, and that's both a positive and a negative in some ways. But yeah, I think the biggest critique I have, and it's a boring one, is just that the inclusion of the 4 tracks at the end does make it feel a little lopsided, and also, like, more pointedly, I think takes away from the impact of the suite as a whole by the time you get to the end of it.
Some of the non-committalness of it is kind of what strikes me, where it's like you're doing the suite, but then you're going back on it by having this extra little.
And like,
They're doing
I
20
Drive the
minutes.
Hearse is a great ending.
They're doing the sweet heat.
I Drive the Hearse is a great ending, right? Like, it really ties a bow around the whole thing beautifully. And
Yeah,
the
nice.
power of that, I think, is robbed somewhat by having these appended extra tracks. But if you had like a fully fledged second disc that were more expanded upon, and you did this kind of like, I don't know, what's an analogy here? Like, I don't know, In Your Honor or something, except it's not
Guns
loud and
N'
quiet.
Roses.
You know, I don't know, but like, if you did that thing where you just went out with this melancholy style, like 2-disc extravaganza, I would be like, that would be so ostentatious and so ridiculous that it would be even easier to forgive the wackiness of the way that the suite is constructed, because the whole thing would just be fundamentally ridiculous, and that would make it even more easy to kind of get, you know what I mean? Whereas, yeah, there is a sense of non-committalness to the way this is put together that I definitely think that the band could have improved on. And I think a younger iteration of the band might have put in the extra time to make work. I almost feel like there's this quintessential Britishness here, where like if this were an American band, they would absolutely, without a stroke of second thought, do that 2-hour 2-disc thing. They just go, fuck it, let's do it. Whereas there's this Britishness to Porcupine Tree where it's like, oh yeah, but that's too much, you know, that's a bit, you know, silly. And there's this kind of like, you know, coyness and Britishness to the idea of like not having the full confidence to necessarily do something like that. I don't know, I'm probably projecting completely there, but I feel like
I don't know. I can hear like Richard Barbieri just being in the studio, and Steven's just like, maybe we should just say fuck it and make this whole thing 2 hours. But I can just hear him being like, Steven, nobody's gonna fucking want to listen to that.
Steven Wilson, the type of guy to shove you in a locker but leave the door open.
yeah.
I love that Morgan went for Richard Barbieri to say that, because if you've seen interviews with the band, he absolutely would be the one to be like, Steven, no one's going to fucking listen to this.
Probably wouldn't work very well, but I'm actually quite tempted to take those 4 tracks and then like take some of the tracks on some of their more recent EPs before this and see if I can kind of make a second disc that works in any way. I don't know.
Hey, I'm more than down to like witness that happen.
There is no way that putting Cheating the Polygraph on this album hurts it. So
yeah,
I think we're really getting at the core issue of this album and why we ultimately agree in so many disagreeing ways. And is that it's just, no matter how you slice it, it's a half measure. It either feels like it needs to fully commit, finish a second disc, or trim itself down. It's like how I think most movies that are like 2 hours long are either way too long or way too short, depending on the story.
Yeah.
And it's like, this either needs to be like 4 hours for a mini series or like a 15-minute short film.
Yeah, it kind of feels like they were kind of giddy with confidence at the start of the recording session, but then like after they had like conceptualized the record and recorded most of it, they had this kind of like crisis of self-doubt and thought, what the fuck are we doing? And then just kind of like doubted themselves a little bit at the 11th hour.
That's the annoying thing, is because I know, and you all know with utmost certainty, that they have the fucking chops to pull this off. Like, not even a shadow of a doubt that they could do this and do it right. It's just that they were burnt out. I mean, Wilson's solo career had started already.
And he was probably just a bit more interested in doing that solo work too, which is why I think some of the stuff on here maybe isn't quite as good as it could be.
Yeah, you know
Yeah.
what the funniest part about all of that is that this came out in 2009, right? And after all of this, the next Steven Wilson solo album is Grace for Drowning, which does a kind of similar thing of like splitting itself into these two halves. And as a result of that, having a lot of interesting musical ideas, but also just not really congealing at all.
Yeah,
Well.
yeah.
And I like that record a lot. I'd probably give it the same rating I'd give this. But it's like, it's like the penultimate track is like 23 minutes. It's like, what are you doing, dude?
No,
I
I
think that-
respect it.
Yeah,
And
it's a pretty sick
20
album, but like, it's funny that
23-minute track, 2-minute track album.
August is like, I want you to take these problems and not fix them, but make them worse so that they become
Yeah.
something different.
Like that, like be bad in an original way, and I respect that.
yeah. But anyway, going back to the incident, I think we've really talked a lot about the biggest moments of this record. I want to highlight again, song already been mentioned, but my favorite thing here, the title track. I love the way this song develops. I agree with Morgan. This is an S tier Porcupine Tree song. The way that it starts with this kind of like incredibly murky and sort of very Nine Inch Nails-esque synthesizer. And this song is so Nine Inch Nails, especially in the first half of it.
This album, really?
Yeah. And it kind of just develops and builds and it adds in like just absolutely sick guitar work and then some drumming from Gavin Harrison towards the end. Like there's parts where he's just kind of like feels like he's just abusing his hi-hat and he's just like kind of going all over the kit and trying to like hit every single pad he has. And it's just like the way this thing progresses and develops is an absolute fucking trip. And the chops are, and that's the other thing as well. Like when I'm not getting super into, when I'm not thinking about the record too much, it's really, really easy to just be taken with the sheer chops on display here, which I know is like not an original assessment to make of a Porcupine Tree record, but maybe something that gets a little bit overlooked is the fact that each member of this band, in terms of their instrumental capability and skill, is inarguably operating at their highest capacity. And it's an absolute joy to be in the company of that for an hour plus.
One thing that's important that we need to note about this album that I do think has 100% contributed to its reputation is the fact that this was the last Porcupine Tree album up until,
was
now.
it?
Up until
But
date of recording.
For years, this is where the band stopped. And I think that it's sort of, if you were a fan of the band and they sort of end on this, again, inarguable wink point and compared to what came before it, and an album that feels like it's trying a lot of different things but not committing, I think that sort of sense of like a lack of resolution can certainly contribute to this album's reputation and people just not wanting to interrogate its messiness, because you just kind of have like, it's this big, long, impenetrable thing, and it's like there's lots of ideas, but also I can just listen to Fear of a Blank Planet instead. And look, I mean, that's not my ethos when it comes to record listening, but I can't lie and say that I don't understand it, especially when you immediately have Steven working on his own solo stuff that was quality, and the vast majority of which is probably a little bit better than this album, at least more focused, if nothing else. So the sort of reputation that this has, I think, undeniably comes from the fact that even though the band didn't properly break up or anything, it was just the last Porcupine Tree album that was considered a disappointment for like a decade. So it leaves it in an awkward place to be considered.
Yeah, for sure. From my perspective, it's a rare luxury to get to hear what a less focused Porcupine Tree sounds like and have it be a record like this.
I kind of get what you mean.
And I guess I'll wrap my thoughts up by saying, like, regardless of how you feel about this record or, whether you enjoy listening to it or not, you have to I at least think you have to be glad this exists, because even if it might, I don't know, be nicer for you to think of the band kind of going out on Fear of a Blank Planet, I see this album as a victory lap. And I like the way that it is this final flex of all of the different things this band can do. And the fact that when they're not kind of honing in on a specific singular idea, they can still wow you, and they can still kind of do these things that remind you why they're some of the most talented musicians in the prog sphere. I'm reminded a lot of that. There's a Smashing Pumpkins song. It's like a loose song, like it's like a 20-minute song where like all it is just like riffs that Billy Corgan had like never used, and he just kind of like stitched them together into this big 20-minute song. And I can't remember what it's called now, and it's bugging me. But anyway, it reminds me of that a lot, because it's like all of these different ideas that were never fleshed out into conventional songs that nevertheless you kind of sit and listen to it and you're like, Jesus Christ. Like,
you're still listening to one of the best guitarists of the 90s do some of his best riffs, and
yeah,
the appeal of that is not going away no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of ultimately where I come down, is it feels like a luxury to get an insight into, you know, a more haywire, a more scattershot, like an insight into what this band sounds like when they don't, you know, impose the heavy restrictions of creative perfection on themselves, like a lot of bands do. Not to say that bands shouldn't, but it's a nice insight into what it can sound like when they don't.
It's also like I feel like Porcupine Tree is such a band that's in lockstep with each other that it also proves that like the second they even remotely went off the rails, they decided maybe we should call it quits for a little while here. Because like I really do feel like a lesser band would have pushed themselves and just really petered out and stretched themselves thin. But they were just like, the second they were just like, all right, I think we're tired. Let's end things temporarily speaking. And I respect them immensely for that decision.
Yeah, and the song I was trying to think of by Smashing Pumpkins is the Pistachio Medley from '96. There we go. Which I recommend checking out if you haven't, because it's an experience. Well, that brings us to our conclusion. Shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings for Porcupine Tree, The Incident? Jake, why don't you lead us off?
My three favorite tracks here got to be The Blind House, one of Porcupine Tree's best ragers. The Incident, a combination of one of their best ragers and one of their best atmospheric tracks, I think. Love the ending to this song. And probably, yeah, Time Flies, favorite thing here. Epic 11-minute song, just burst the door down, kicks ass the whole time. Least favorite track, unsurprisingly, I'm not really a fan of Drawing the Line. And overall, I waver. I feel like each time I listen to this album, every other time it's a 6 and every other time it's a 7. And I'm just kind of like, what is it today? Am I feeling like my patience is being tested more? So I'm going to give it a tentative 6.5 just because it tends to waffle between the two.
Waffle.
My favorite songs on here are The Blind House, Time Flies, and I'll go with Bunny the Cat. The least favorite is whatever that bullshit's Drawing the Fucking Line. I don't know.
I'm drawing the fucking line. I'm drawing the
giving
fucking
this
line.
album a 6 out of 10.
My three favorites are title track. I will say the closer, Remember Me Lover, and Octane Twisted. And least favorite, naturally, is Drawing the Line. Yeah, I will give this a 7.
Nice.
Nice of this album to have two very good closers on it.
That's twice as many as most albums have.
My three favorite tracks on this record are The Incident, Time Flies, and Bonnie Bear. Bonnie the Cat. Bonnie Bear.
Bonnie Bear.
Least favorite track. Just to be different, I'm going to say Degree Zero of Liberty. But that's still a good interstitial moment. It's just I didn't want to be the fourth person in a row to say Drawing the Line, I guess. So I just lied. And
so
yeah,
you're a coward.
You know, like a liar.
And I'm going to give this album a 7.5, which means that overall, we have an average rating of 6.8 for Porcupine Tree's The Incident. Stick around because just this Sunday coming, we will be talking about Porcupine Tree's new album, Closure Continuation. Cannot wait to expound on that bad boy.
Speaking of albums that have bonus tracks,
Yeah. Yes, we're gonna be in our fucking element. Just you wait and see. So stick around for that.
You
as
have
well.
no idea how I've just been sitting here like pretending like I haven't been listening to that nonstop for the last 48 hours.
Anyway, we're going to be diving deep into that. If you want to and you haven't already, you can check out our previous Porcupine Tree videos. I'll put a link to those in the description below. We have a full playlist that you should check out as well. We also talked about Stephen Wilson's amazing Hand Cannot Erase as well, and I'm sure we will probably inevitably end up talking about more in the future as well. So if you aren't already, please consider subscribing to make sure you don't miss out on that. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, consider heading on over to the link in the description and giving us a like via that route, because it really does help us out a lot. Plus, also another thing that helps us out a lot is comments as well. We want to hear what you think of this record. We want to hear what side you come down on, whether you think it's an unforgivable indulgence or whether you think it's a forgotten classic, or whether you're like us and somewhere in the middle. Let us know what you think in the comments below as well, and let us know if you're excited. Well, no, don't let us know if you're excited, because you've probably already heard the new Porcupine Tree album, but regardless, stick around for that.
And if you're not excited, fuck you.
If you want to go above and beyond and support us some more, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, become one of our besties, have our eternal thanks, and get entitled to certain perks, such as having priority comment response, getting to use cool emojis of our fucking faces in those comments. Plus, if you want to recommend us a record to listen to and feedback on, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Also, you get your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel, which is pretty fucking sick if you ask me. That's right, total strangers will remember your name forever, because it will be ingrained into the fabric of this very thing that we have spent so much of our lives dedicating ourselves to by this point in time, August.
As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Nike.
I'm joined the fucking line.